The very first part of the kinematic sequence that we look at here in the golf lab is the transition sequence. And most people out there have been trained to look at the peak speed sequence first, and there's certainly nothing wrong with that. The reason we look at transition sequence first is when we go to our PGA Tour database, we see a lot more commonality in the way these golfers change direction than the way they actually hit those peak speed sequence notes and deliver the energy down to the club. So the first thing we want to talk about is, what do we see the best players in the world doing? And not just our PGA Tour database, but it mirrors what we see with TPI or with Phil Cheatham. We have a couple things going on, and the first one is that when we go to change direction, over 95% of PGA Tour players we've tested across all these different educational bodies, we see that the lower body, the pelvis, is the first thing that starts to rotate towards the target. And more often than not, we see these efficient professional players have this proximal to distal relationship to start that downswing. So as they're starting to draw the club back, that lower body is going to go first, and then the upper body, and then the arm, and the last thing to change direction is going to be the golf club. Now, within that transition sequence, we see several different patterns. And two of these patterns could be ideal for your golfer depending on their muscle fiber composition. And one of these patterns is certainly not desirable for the full swing, but it's a trend we see in the best players in short game. So I want to talk to you a little bit about what these three patterns are and what they mean to us. So the first pattern is something that we would call loading. And ideally, this is what we want to see, and we're even going to break this down a little bit more when we get into our segmental loading section. But loading is when we have the proximal segment, let's say that line that represents pelvis rotation starts to climb up, and it's actually going above or traveling at a higher rotational velocity towards the target than the upper body. So to give you an idea what that looks like, that's going to be here, where they're both going towards, but that lower body was rotating faster. Okay? The second type of pattern that we see will be called riding. And that's when we see these two lines, let's say pelvis and upper body, they're going right on top of each other. That means that both of these segments are traveling at the same rotational velocity. They're moving right together. Now, the last type of pattern that I would say would only be desirable in short game would be called fanning. An example of this would be, let's say when we do look at short game, we see the arm in most players riding faster or above the upper body. So to give you an idea what that would look like, that arm is going to come off the body first and start rotating towards the target a little bit faster and a little bit ahead of the upper body. Understanding those three patterns will really help you learn to read the graphs in terms of power and where your golfer is creating their power and where they have opportunity. Because those three types of patterns directly relate to three types of muscle contractions. So there's three basic ways that I can contract a muscle. Say the first one, what most people end up doing in the gym, say like a bicep curl, will be called a concentric contraction. Now, this shortens the muscle, and this is actually the least powerful type of muscular contraction. So if you imagine, I can probably hold about maybe a 35, maybe 40-pound weight, and I'm actually strong enough to shorten that. Okay, so that's concentric contraction. Now, let's say you gave me, like a 55-pound dumbbell, and you put it right here in my hand. I'm not going to be strong enough to lift it up, but I'm also going to be strong enough not to let it drop. And so that's a type of muscle contraction where the length of the muscle doesn't actually change. That would be called an isometric contraction. And that isometric contraction would represent that riding pattern that we see in the graphs. And believe it or not, that actually puts out more force through the muscle than that concentric contraction, which would be representative of that fanning pattern. Now, the last and most powerful type of muscular contraction is called eccentric. So now for this one, let's imagine that we put a 80-pound dumbbell in my hand. Now, I'm not even strong enough to hold it, and so I'm going to slow it down as it drops down towards the ground, and that eccentric contraction is actually going to be the most type of power my muscle can put out. And that's the type of contraction we see happening when there is that segmental load, that loading pattern of proximal rotating faster towards the target than distal. Now that we've understood that, let's go and take a look at how we get energy out of the system. So that transition really tells us how the golfer puts power into the system. The next step in our process to analyze a player's kinematic sequence is where we go and look at those peak speeds. Now, most people look at this first, and like I said, that's totally fine. We like to look at it second, because when we see that peak speed, that's one segment decelerating due to the acceleration of another, and we take a look at how much rotational velocity we can gain, and ideally we want to see this almost doubling pattern going up there. The reason that we like to look at it second is a lot of the characteristics we see there are caused by things that happened earlier. So I like to think of this peak speed sequence as how the golfer puts energy out, how they release energy that they created in transition down onto the golf ball. And the way I was trained was that we want to see this perfect proximal to distal pattern, right? So the peak speed is going to come first from the pelvis, next from the torso, then from the lead arm, and then lastly down from the club at impact. Over the last few years, as we've got more data, more captures from younger PGA Tour players, we're starting to see a little bit different pattern emerge. So we really feel as though there's two optimum kinematic sequences. One for efficiency, which we've been studying and working on for years, and that's that proximal to distal deceleration. But when we take a look at what we're seeing with a lot of these new players, we see where the arm actually decelerates a little bit earlier. And remember, if the arm is going to decelerate earlier, that deceleration is triggered by the distal segment starting to fire. So that would be the club firing a little bit earlier. And then we see actually the torso hit the peak speed last. And while we certainly know that that's not going to maximize the speed, we believe we're seeing that pattern manifest because the athletic development is so good for these young players now that even without optimum efficiency, they still have the ability to generate club head speeds north of 120 miles an hour. And having the arm and club get out in front of the body a little bit more can help them minimize closure rate to have more stable club face projection, and also prevent too much of a rightward path for the right-handed player, which can make it a little bit more difficult to control the golf ball. So it neutralizes some things we feel like, and I think it's important that you as a coach are aware there is a lot of variability in the peak speed sequence of players. So I think it's important that when you're using 3D, you're aware that there is a wide variety of peak speed sequences that we see in world-class golf. Now that being said, if you're working with a junior player and they're still in their developmental stage of forming that pattern, let's say, I don't know, from 6 to, maybe even 16 years old, I would certainly chase that efficient model to help them get the most club head speed with the least amount of effort possible. Let's go ahead now and we're going to start to take a look at our next step in process of kinematic sequence analysis. The next section of our analysis of the kinematic sequence is segmental loading. Now, this is like a level 2 analysis of transition sequence. And we talked earlier about those 3 different types of patterns, but now I want to talk to you about how we can do a little more functional analysis with them. And for those of you out there that know me, you know that one of my favorite things is to maximize club head speed. And so the first thing that I do when I look at segmental loading is I want to read the power. I want to see what section of their body, what link, core link, shoulder link, wrist link, are they loading in order to increase the speed of the club when it gets down to impact. So when we take a look at that, if I see those, that pelvis line, going first and staying up above the line of the torso, that's that loading, that's when I know I've got this type of separation and I know that they're generating some power from the core. And if I see riding, that's okay. But if I see fanning and that player's come to me and they want to hit the ball farther, that lets me know there's a place that I can tackle right away. But before I go to try and change that, I have to understand if there's a physical limitation that's preventing them from loading that segment, be it lack of mobility, poor stability, or previous injury. Or I just need to understand, is it a coordination issue where they don't know how to actually independently control the club shaft from the arm. So I want to know what links they're loading. Now, the other thing that this starts to let me know is, are they at risk of having an injury? And when you start to look at a lot of graphs of a lot of different players, you're going to see every once in a while that you've got one player that's overloading a segment, where they have a massive, massive load through one portion of that transition sequence, and there's minimal load through the others. And when you see that, it's something that should set a red flag off, and you understand there could be an injury risk by overstressing that segment. When we take a look at juniors, a lot of times, they're so flexible that we see a massive over separation of the pelvis and of the trunk. And when we over separate, that actually causes a little bit weaker contraction of the muscles, but it can put a lot of shear force on the spine. It can lead to back issues. When we look at a lot of tour players, it can be pretty easy to spot when we could see a thumb, wrist, or even elbow injury when we see this massive lag through transition, where we see the arm moving, very early, and we see a huge gap coming out between where the arm is rotating and where the club is rotating. So definitely understand segmental loading as a mechanism for predicting injury risk, for understanding how they generate the power, and understanding where you can perform some interventions to help them generate more power, but in a safe and repeatable manner. The last step in our process for analyzing kinematic sequence here at the lab is to take a look at the deceleration pattern. Now, when we say sequence, that means order of operations. When we say pattern, we're referring to like the shapes of those curves. And as we talked about, that upward slope shows us the rate of acceleration, the downward slope shows us the rate of deceleration. So for us, this last little step, it shows us the deceleration, or how rapidly that particular segment can stabilize. And when we have a segment that stabilizes very rapidly, we can see a lot of rotational energy often transfer into that proximal segment, and we get greater speed gains. The other hand, if we see, sort of what we would call, like, let's say the pelvis flatlines, where it comes up and it hits that peak speed, but it never really dips back down. It just kind of keeps floating. That's a signal to us that there's a lack of stability in that particular segment, and that means we're not going to get all the speed or control that we could out of those distal segments. So for that last step, definitely be sure to take a look at the deceleration pattern, or how quickly each one of those segments can stabilize after it reaches peak speed. So there's our full process. We start off with transition sequence. We look at transition sequence because that is the most recognizable common trait of the kinematic sequence as it pertains to elite golfers. The second thing we look at is the peak speed sequence, because that tells us how that golfer releases rotational energy down to the club. After that, we're going to go and take a look at segmental loading and see, do they have a risk of injury? Where does the power come from? And where do I have opportunities to generate more power? And then that last portion is going to be looking at deceleration pattern to look at how well does each segment stabilize, and is there opportunity there to fine tune and squeeze just a little bit more efficiency out of this player. We think if you follow those steps, you're going to start to have a little bit better process and get results faster for your players.